Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, the region's longest-running public affairs program. Legislative Report is a weekly review of activity at the state capitol featuring lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota. Most importantly, it's an opportunity for viewers to call or email their legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello, welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, Greg Grell, and we're getting down to the wire now with the state budget bills, and it's about time that we move on into some good conversation about those budget bills. Let's start with Representative Eric Simonson, also here Representative Jason Metza and Representative Mary Murphy, and thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. Representative Metza, there was a lot of debate Thursday, a late night for the House. The supplemental budget bill was passed after much debate. Tell us a little bit about the bill, what's in it, what you thought of it.
Well, so essentially, it's been kind of a strange year. A lot of our budget bills are actually what we'd call omnibus, where it's three different committees kind of all smudged together. And so we had state government, public safety, and health and human services in the last bill. Kind of the disappointing thing from my perspective is it seems like right now, the legislature is not making investments with the surplus we have, and we could be spending a little bit more money. Right now it's all zero targets, so they're getting prepared more for negotiation rather than for helping Minnesotans. So,
and Representative Murphy, we've been talking about this the last few weeks, that the surplus hasn't been spent, at least on the House side. The Senate maybe thinking about spending some of that money, so a lot of things will probably change once these bills get to the conference committee, do you think?
That's correct, and the most important thing is that the bills pass with enough votes to get to conference committee. And the next 2 weeks for sure, that's where things will go. Whether there's one conference committee or whether there's three conference committees is yet to be decided. Keeping in mind that the tax conference committee is still out there from last year, and the transportation conference committee is still out there from last year. So it's possible that, like the House is advocating, that most of the surplus money should be used for the tax committee to reduce various kinds of taxes, and the Transportation Committee should be using the one-time surplus for permanent transportation goals. That can't be done, but they're still talking as if it could. And so whether we get a sustainable transportation bill or whether we just put one-time money in is yet to be decided.
And Representative Murphy, you mentioned that there might be one conference committee or there might be three, and that's because there's a differing number of budget bills out there right now?
Correct. The Senate had just one budget bill. All their finance bills were contained in the one omnibus bill that passed out of the Senate on Thursday.
Okay. Representative Simonson, from your point of view, would it be better to have three conference committees or just one big conference committee? It seems like an awful lot of work for one small body to kind of pare down in the amount of time we have left.
You know, I think if the bills lined up going into conference, it would be easier with one conference committee, but the way it's structured, it almost seems impossible. And with just 3 weeks to go, I mean, the reality is setting in that it's going to take almost a small miracle to get through those.
One thing about that bill passed Thursday night, Representative Simonson, it was also billed as a public safety bill. Anything of significance on the public safety side of that bill?
Boy, there's sure not much in there. They had a zero target as well, and they didn't make any of the investments in any of the public safety initiatives that the governor was recommending. And I mean, there was a few small policy pieces in there, but essentially, there's nothing much in there that's really new and exciting. That's for sure.
All right, and Representative Metza, the House passed a bill this week that would increase funding for broadband funding in rural areas. I think it was about a $40 million bill. Democrats wanted more. The GOP supporters say it will leverage additional federal funds. What do you think about the broadband bill that was passed and potential for more federal funding?
Well, Representative Simonson and I and Representative Simonson, to give credit where it's due, has kind of taken the lead in the House on this over the last few years. I've been very active in it as well, but I think it was 15 million total in new spending now. Part of it's some money that we had put in before, which is currently going out the door for this year. However, overall, I think it really misses the mark on what we could have done. Both Representative Simonson and I carried amendments on the floor for the jobs bill, I believe was on Wednesday. And you know, it's disappointing that when we have this surplus that we can't make some investments. And I think we've heard from all over the state and every rural community that they need the access to high-speed internet, not only for things like Netflix and things that we might perceive as family activities, but to grow jobs and to have an incentive for a larger business to move into your community. And we know that with the nearly $2 billion that it's going to take to actually fully build out the system in Minnesota, that 15 million is just a drop in the bucket. The governor came in at 100, and the Senate came in at 80, and I think all three of us here are pretty supportive of the $80 million mark on lining up with the Senate language, which would provide, you know, kind of 3 tiers of access, both to some communities who already have broadband, but not quite at what you can get in a larger city, and then for the truly unserved areas that don't have much access at all right now.
Representative Simonson, give an example of maybe what kind of benefits there would be to a better broadband service, especially in rural Minnesota where maybe folks don't have the same access they do in bigger urban areas?
Sure. So there's a couple of things actually, and if you look at you know, greater Minnesota and some of the more rural areas, you have small towns. And within the small towns, there's a number of businesses. There perhaps is a school or a healthcare facility. And then usually surrounding the town, you might have, you know, rural communities or farms. And any one of those, as an individual, can certainly benefit from a high quality broadband service. And the whole perspective, the whole idea is to try to keep people in greater Minnesota. You know, we want jobs to grow there. We want communities to thrive there. We want people to, you know, raise their families there and have their kids have an opportunity to stay in greater Minnesota. But internet today is like electricity was 80 years ago, you know, and if people don't have access to high quality broadband, you know, you see them migrate to the metro areas, whether it be the Twin Cities or Duluth or Mankato or St. Cloud. It's a problem, and we need to be moving on this a little bit faster than we have been.
Representative Murphy, decades ago, co-ops were formed to bring electricity out to rural areas. Do you think we're getting to the point where maybe we need to do something like that in Minnesota to get broadband, fast internet connections out to the rural areas?
Well, we have to have some answer for the areas that can't be served or are not being served by competitive businesses. Or we either have to give incentives or we have to have the school service units do it. There's a possibility that they could serve their area if they could make the contacts with the companies that deliver the service. I don't know what the answer is, but Representative Simonson knows a lot more about it than I do. Representative Sundin does too, and he's going to be learning more. But there are pockets in all of our districts, maybe not Eric's, but there are pockets where right now in very populated areas, people can't get it. Lakewood, there's pockets in Lakewood. There's pockets in Normanna. There's pockets in Hermantown where there is no service they're still using dial-up. And that's, especially if you're running a business, that's no way to do it.
And Representative Simonson, it really does seem like fast internet connections really are something everybody needs in the 21st century. I mean, it's the way business is being done now.
Right, and we're spoiled here in Duluth because, you know, most folks right in the city proper have it. Yeah. But you only have to go a few miles out of town to the north of here and you run into these areas that just have dial-up, or perhaps they're relying on some wireless system. But the reality is, if you're not able to be competitive, your business isn't going to last very long. And you know, having access to the broadband too is important for education as we go forward, because we want to make sure we incorporate that into educational strategies going forward.
All right, well, we'll move on now to another issue, and we're glad that we've got some lawmakers working on that issue, especially for folks in rural Minnesota who want good broadband connections. Representative Metsa, thanks for traveling down from the range today. We've been waiting to have a range lawmaker on because the IRRB board is getting some attention at the legislature. There's House and Senate bills dealing with the makeup of the board. The House GOP wants to remove northeastern Minnesota lawmakers from the board. Talk a little bit about how this all came up, what's happening right now.
Yeah, so essentially, last year we had asked the legislature, when I say we, had asked the legislative auditor to take a look at the IRRB, which is a state agency, and in that work they found some things that need to get more attention. I know we talked about some of them a while back on Almanac North, but the basics there, without going into too much detail, is there were 3 accounts where we didn't have the governor sign off on things, which is what people have been probably hearing about with the unconstitutionality of the board. So the House range delegation, House members, and the DFL range in the Senate put together a bill that addresses all of that, and we talked to Auditor Nobles, and he seems to think that it meets all the worries that they had and would correct that situation. The bill that the House Republicans have basically takes a completely different approach to it and reinvents the IRRB. The disappointing thing to me there is that it seems more political than anything, and I think it's meant to negotiate with Senator Bach, and it's unfortunate that people take personal issues like that and try to make them legislative. And the reason I say it's personal is because they didn't reach out to anyone at the IRRB agency. Commissioner Phillips didn't get a call, none of his staff did. They didn't reach out to any county commissioners in the region, any city council members, any school board members, and the people that this would affect. And usually when we're working on bills together that are going to go somewhere, especially if you're working on bills that affect other people's districts, you reach out and you talk and have a conversation about them. And I think it's a little disingenuous for them to be carrying the legislation. It's got a committee hearing actually Tuesday in Jobs, which both Representative Simonson and I sit on. I'm going to be placing an amendment to do what our bill would do. The House Democrats, I should also add, have not gotten a hearing on the bill, although it was introduced after deadline, as was the Republican bill. So we'd hope that as they move forward, that it doesn't turn into another Iron Range political football this session when we're passing huge budget bills off the floor, 6 of them in a week, and it took the first 5 weeks of session to pass an unemployment extension. I think it shows that the priorities of the majority are not necessarily lining up with the priorities of the average Minnesotans and voters right now, who seem to just want us to put our politics aside and get the job done. And I think we're all committed to giving that a go and running it through the end of session. But I do think right now that bill is kind of a poison pill in terms of dealing with Senator Bach.
Representative Metsa, one of the things that we hear a lot about, especially from the range lawmakers when it comes to this, is that the money that's being spent by the IRRB is a payment in lieu of taxes, basically property taxes. It's a tax that the mines pay. And local bodies of government typically decide how that money is going to be spent in their area. The Republicans in the House, they want to take that power away, perhaps even spread that wealth around the state. Is that a good idea?
Well, I think you'd find quite a bit of outcry from all of our communities. The money's stretched pretty thin as is, especially with production taxes being down because of the lull in the mining industry recently. The way that the taxes are collected, you're correct, are in lieu of a property tax. And how we do that is the tonnage that's collected out of the mines and sold on the market is taxed at $256 a ton. And when that money goes into the state agency, it flows through. As a board member, we don't touch a majority of the funding coming through. It actually goes out into formulas to our school districts, our local municipalities, and to the county. And then everyone within the tax relief area gets a buy down on their property taxes locally as well. And so I think it would be pretty hard pressed to say that there would be a lot of support in the taconite assistance area for taking that money and spreading it any thinner than it already is.
And before we move on to other issues, one thing related to IRRB is recently there's been a push to put together a funding package for a company that's interested in locating on the range. Now the identity of the company is not being released, but I believe it's a wood products company.
Yeah, the mystery company.
The mystery company?
As we're calling it. So yeah, it's essentially the whole purpose of the IRRB outside those formulas, and the remaining funds, the Doug Johnson Fund being one of them, are to build economic development opportunities for the region, to diversify the economy. And this siding company would be a great example of something that I think the region could benefit from. They're a large player in the market. It would be, unlike mining permitting, where it can take, like with PolyMet, up to 10 years to get a permit. This would be something that we could have a couple hundred jobs in the next few years, and a company up and running, producing both local property tax and a lot of jobs and income tax from that. And so what we're hoping to do is compete with Michigan and Canada. And Canada actually, the Queen, so to speak, owns the land up there, or the timber, and so they can compete with lower wood prices than we can here in Minnesota. And really what I see our region having a significant up for bringing this in is Michigan doesn't have a huge infrastructure with logging, and we currently still do with our 2 biomass plants up north, and a long history throughout the region of both paper supplies, OSB, and a number of other things. Having that workforce already out in the woods, which can take some time, and so I think Minnesota is very well poised to get that project here if we can get a small incentive package put together and have all those other assets that we already have. So.
And certainly the wood products industry could use the shot in the arm right now, just like the mining industry could. So.
Absolutely. This would be, just so folks get an idea, about 140 trucks, semi-truck loads a day of wood going into the shop. So the streets in Aurora would be full of logging trucks.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. Thanks very much for the update on that. This is Minnesota Legislative Report. Of course, we're here to answer your questions. And late last week, we didn't have time to get into a question from Hamilton, but it's for Representative Simonson. And Hamilton was wondering, Representative Simonson, where your bill is on the charter school issue. This came up a while back when the Duluth Public Schools considered selling the old Duluth Central High School property to a company that would have used it for a charter school. You've got some legislation dealing with that, and Hamilton wants to know where that's at.
So there's 2 different things happening on kind of parallel tracks here. But on one hand, we've put together a financial incentive package in terms of a sales tax waiver that has gone. We've had a hearing in the House. They've had a hearing in the Senate. It seems like if we can, and there's no guarantee that we will get a tax bill, but if we do pass a tax bill, there's high potential that it might be in there. But essentially what it would do is give a private developer that wanted to purchase that Central High School site and redevelop it into something else, as long as the end result was that the property itself would be taxable, they would get up to a $5 million relief on sales tax that they might spend, purchasing materials or equipment or what have you to do the redevelopment. So there's that piece is moving forward. The piece that has to do with the transparency of charter schools and how they do their funding for their facilities is probably going to, for sure going to be on hold until next year. But the plan is to take, the time over the interim and do some more research, put together some ideas from some different folks. But ultimately, we want to just make sure that the public is fully aware of how the funding mechanisms work for both the charter school as well as the public schools.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we may get some questions about that. You never know as time goes on. And Representative Murphy, one thing that happened this week at the legislature, the E through 12 bill was passed by the House. The E through 12 budget bill, I believe, passed by the House. Can we talk a little bit about that? I know Democrats haven't been happy with what the majority party has been pushing in the House on E through 12?
It had, I think, 84 votes for it. I voted yes. Many of my colleagues in the Democratic Party did not, because it didn't do enough. Many of these bills are passing with fewer Democratic votes than you might think, because it leaves people behind and it does not do enough. And so this bill, however, was different. The education finance, or the early childhood through 12th grade bill, did not have a target above 0. But we found, or Jennifer Loon, the chair of the committee who did most of the putting together the bill, she did find almost $55 million through past appropriations that she readjusted the amounts and put almost $55 million new dollars in, and for one-time kind of spending. It didn't do anything to the formula or to all the school districts, but it made a couple significant changes in maximum effort schools and equity across the state. And so it, as I said before, it got us to the table for the conference committee. And in addition to the K-12 bill, there was also the higher ed bill with that one together. And so, and that one was really too bad, because that one just stayed at 0, and nothing was added for the higher ed. And we had hoped that there would be some buy down of college loans, or some kind of addressing student loans or tuition, so that not as much money would have to be borrowed in the future. But that one just was pretty basic, nothing. And so, but we do have hopes that with the Senate, making investments and spending some of that $900 million surplus, that both of those situations will come back better.
And for those who maybe are longtime viewers of Minnesota Legislative Report, Representative Murphy, there is a strategy for why you might vote in favor of a bill, whereas your colleagues won't, and that's because you cannot be on the conference committee if you don't vote in favor of the bill, correct?
Pretty much.
So you may end up on the conference committee.
Hardly anyone does. I would hope I would be, but I'm not sure. And it depends if we're having 3 conference committees or 1 conference committee. I can't imagine that I will be on the conference committee if there's only 5 conferees from the House, because for sure, probably 4 of those 5 will be Republicans from various, whether it's the jobs person or the Ways and Means chair, or Jennifer Loon, the chair of E12, or Bud Nornis, the chair of higher ed. I don't know how that will play of who the 4 at the most, or at my best guess is that there will be 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And I don't know who that 1 Democrat will be, but I don't think it will be me, because I didn't vote yes on Friday or on Thursday.
Okay.
I voted yes
On the E12.
on Tuesday, but not on Thursday. But and I didn't vote on the jobs, yes on the jobs, or environment, or ag. And so, but you were talking before about when this gets to conference committee, and if it's 10 conferees or if it's some sub-conferences, that's where the public is left out. Because there's no way, if there's subcommittees, like if there's education, with environment, with jobs, with agriculture, and the other and the health and human services. Each of those topics probably will have a sub-conference committee then, but they can't be appointed conferees, so it'll be just who the speaker picks or who the committee, who has the most voice in the committee kind of thing. And public those meetings wouldn't be announced, and those people, there would be no transparency. And so there you get to the dark of night, closed, smoke-filled rooms, closed, although smoking's gone.
You can't smoke in the
smoking
Capitol
is
anymore.
gone totally. But all the rest of the things that we used to talk about and it's just, you don't know if the minority is represented in any way. And they won't be able to tell what topics are being discussed at what times, or there might be one or two open meetings for public information, but it'll be mostly, can you come in and talk about this to 3 people kind of thing. And that's not right, and that's not good government, and you don't get good decision making in that kind of a process.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens, and maybe if they do conference just the E through 12 bill, you could maybe be representative on that conference.
I expect if they did just the E through 12 bill, I will have a say, yes, because I am the lead Democrat on that, and I do good work, and if I can bring back what they're talking about to the people on my committee, then we try to get input from them for the things that they advocate for. And that's what it's all about.
Before we move on from education, each of you represent some different school districts. Representative Metsa, just talk a little bit about what this bill could mean for, say, schools in the Virginia area, what's needed in your region.
So there actually wasn't a lot of, like Representative Murphy said, there wasn't a lot of new spending. There was some money. She was very generous, I feel, in saying new money. And kind of what we're seeing is a reoccurring theme of them going into accounts that maybe have a little bit of a balance in them, but essentially aren't doing as much in terms of bringing a new program to light or a new investment, so much as robbing from one program to fund a portion or portions of other programs. And so there are a number of things. I really feel like the Senate position in terms of providing school districts opportunity to have pre-K, some more investment in the school formula would be more directions that I think we should head. So I would, hope that Representative Murphy as well gets on the conference committee and is able to bring some of those things in. I know we've been on here in the past. A lot of districts, although we invested significantly when we were in charge 2 years ago, are still in a position from the previous 8 years of cuts and or small increases that they still haven't caught up even to inflation. So a lot of these school districts are just basically dealing with inflation. And I really think, especially with the surplus, we should be investing.
And Representative Simonson, I hear a lot of concern about the Duluth School District, public school district, and declining enrollment and so on. Is there any help at all in the E12 bill for the Duluth public schools?
Not in the House bill, but it does highlight really what the need is, and the reality is that as much talk as there is about decline in enrollment, the reality is, we have some of the very best teachers, and we need to give them the tools that they need to get the job done, and the reality is we need to make our class sizes smaller. So we do need to invest new dollars under this K-12 formula in order to make sure that we can spread people out and allow teachers to have the opportunities to work with some of these kids. And I think as far as the folks that are leaving the district for whatever reason, that's probably one of the primary things that we can do to make a significant difference about retaining parents and kids and bringing them back as well. Is just to make sure that we can keep our class sizes smaller so that the teachers have the ability to do their work.
Well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Call in your questions right now for our lawmakers who are here representing you at the state capitol. The numbers are 788-2844 or toll-free 1-877-307-8762. Representative Metz, a bill from Balkan must have been listening to our discussion about the IRRB. He's asking, why are Twin Cities legislators allowed to interfere with IRRB decisions?
Well, Bill, I think that's been a long-standing question for quite a while at the legislature, long before my time. Essentially, usually we do a pretty good job of working well together, but this majority has really kind of taken it upon themselves to essentially, with Senate Majority Leader Bach in charge, basically try to use bills like this to negotiate for the whole package that they would like in their tax bill, say, in their jobs bill. And so it's really a lot more gamey and political in nature, more so than anything. So I don't expect them really to go anywhere. If we didn't have Majority Leader Bach there right now, it might be a different story. This is a fight we'll probably continue to have over the next many years. But I think right now, I wouldn't get too worried about all the funds disappearing out there and different lawmakers getting appointed, because I think the whole legislature as a whole believes that if we were going to make that kind of drastic change, that there would be input from the region, and a significant amount of it. So,
all right. One of the big bills that the legislature usually deals with in the off years is a bonding bill. And this Monday, the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate are going to release their bonding bill. We know the Republicans on the House side want a small bonding bill. Representative Simonson, I'll start with you on the bonding bill. First off, what are you hearing about what the Senate priorities might be, and is it looking like there will be a bonding bill? There's even concern that there's such a broad difference of opinion that maybe there won't be a bonding bill this year.
The one thing you can bet on is that the Senate will release their bonding bill tomorrow. I think that's a safe bet. And just from the Senate perspective, I think it's going to more align with what the governor's bill was. Might be actually a little more. I think you'll see a little bit more emphasis on HEAPR and funding of basic infrastructure for both the university and MnSCU. But exactly what's in it remains to be seen, but we've been in conversations with the bonding chair in the Senate as well as Majority Leader Bach, and I'm guessing from a Duluth area perspective that many of the projects that we're trying to get into a bonding bill will be in that Senate bill. Now, what's in the House bill remains to be seen. We have a target. They've released a target of $600 million. It's entirely possible we never actually even see a House bonding bill. I mean, that we don't know yet because they've not released it. They've not talked about releasing it, and nobody really seems to know exactly what's in the House version.
Representative Murphy, that bonding bill is a little different animal. It doesn't go through the committee process. It just kind of appears and then it's negotiated. Or talk a little bit about how that all comes about.
Well,
it's mysterious.
It is mysterious, but it started last June when projects throughout the state had to apply to the MMB. They had to send in their request that they were applying for going to apply for bonding money, and for what it was for and how much it was going to cost and where they were in the process within their own community and how much was their own community going to put in. And that had to be in probably, I think, in July. And then the bonding committees toured the state. The Senate Bonding Committee and the House Bonding Committee separately toured the state and looked at many, many projects. And if we knew by that time that we had anticipated projects, we worked very hard to get them to stop at our projects and to take it all in. And they did not take in all the projects in this area at the site, but they did. The House and the Senate both met in various places if they didn't meet at the site, and then other groups might have been invited in, like Lake Superior College. They had lunch at Lake Superior the Senate committee had lunch at the Lake Superior College and toured what Lake Superior College was looking for, and what they had just completed for the last round. And then other places came, WLSSD and the airport and Proctor and some other people came and said what they wanted to the committee at that place. And they had a certain amount of time that was adequate for them to say, this is what we want. And then when the House committee visited the Duluth, and then they stopped at NERC. But they made a stop at Hermantown too. It was 7:45 in the morning, but they came to my home and walked in the field and saw some art and picked up their cookies. And then they stopped at the middle school half a mile away, where they would see the site of where the Regional Health and Wellness Center would be as part of the school that's going to be vacated. And so there, and then they went up to the range, and I think the same thing happened on the range, is that there was a central location, but there were individual spots, and then other people could come in and talk about them. And they did that all the way through the state. But since we got to done with the tours and all, it's been very quiet. They've made appointments, the chair or some of the committee people have made individual appointments with people that wanted to come and talk about their projects. But there have been very limited, in Capital Investment Committee, limited hearings. We haven't had hearings on our individual projects like we have been able to do in some years. And so we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. Now, Eric said that one thing for sure was that the Senate was going to announce their bill, like you suggested, tomorrow. If there's no inkling of what's in the House bill, I will be very surprised if the Senate announces tomorrow what their bill is. I don't think the Senate wants to stand out by itself with a big bill and not know what the House has got at all. But maybe I'm more suspicious than Representative Simonson. Yeah.
Representative Metz, it sounds like a little bit of maybe game playing going on then between the House and the Senate?
Yeah, and usually a bonding bill is actually probably the most appropriate spot for the game playing. It's where everyone kind of goes and fights for projects in their district. Every district has more projects than they'll get funding for. Typically, I think it's about $4 billion get put in a biennium for bonding projects. Typically, we fund about a quarter of them in a good year. And right now, for example, in my district, we've got the Miners Memorial Building, we've got AEOA Range Mental Health, we've got a NERC facility getting some upgrades. We've got wastewater treatment projects in Eveleth, or in Gilbert rather, in the East Range with the East Range Joint Powers being Biwabik, Aurora, Hoyt Lakes, and then road projects as well. So overall, when we're dealing with that, we got to kind of prioritize. We've seen this year so far, the House Republicans essentially go from roughly $800 million is what they came out at last year in terms of their target, and this year they lowered that by $200 million. And I think that's one of the unfortunate things. I don't think any Minnesotans out there have a problem saving themselves a future property tax increase by getting state funds to do things like, rebuild their sewer systems. Duluth's got a huge project in their steam plant. So a lot of great investments out there. And, the unfortunate thing I really think is we've seen some movement of capital investment bills that would end up in the bonding jurisdiction move through other committees. However, our communities haven't had a chance necessarily at the Capitol this session to actually speak to the members of the Capital Investment Committee. And I think one of the most important things for providing a state a pipeline is by having those hearings, so we get the, kind of wishes of the communities from all over the state, and we can kind of get a roadmap of where we're heading in bonding. And they just haven't taken the initiative to give, not even their members, but let alone the minority, those hearings. So I hope that over the next few weeks, we work a lot harder to get up to a point where, whether it be tomorrow or later in the week, that we have a bonding bill that's strong and invests in regions all over the state in a well-balanced way.
And Representative Simonson, one of the Duluth projects on the bonding list is Glensheen Mansion, which is asking for some money to help shore up some failing infrastructure. That's a little bit of a controversial measure. You want to talk about that a little bit?
I don't know, it's not all that controversial to me, I don't think, but I mean, that's a structure that's really important to Duluth and to the region in terms of its history and what it brings. And it's not been invested in properly over the last number of decades, quite frankly. And with a new director on board now that's got a lot of energy and a lot of vision for the future of that facility, he's identified a pretty significant investment that's needed to bring that building back up to where it should be, if for no other reason than at least to maintain it to the state that it's in. So he's identified a fairly significant number, but we know for a fact that anything that we can get Glensheen will be good in terms of taking the first steps to try to get it back on track. But the controversy part is really about, some people ask the question, who should own Glensheen Mansion? And it's been in the hands of the university ever since the family gave it to the university, several years ago. And the question is just kind of coming up now, is that the proper place for it, or should it maybe perhaps belong with the Historical Society? Well, that's a very broad conversation that perhaps need to happen with all the stakeholders involved. And I think the most disappointing thing to me now is I see a lawmaker, from the majority party that is representing St. Cloud has introduced a bill to change the ownership from the university to the Historical Society, but I can guarantee you he hasn't talked to me about it, and I doubt that he's talked to any of our Duluth area delegation about it. And he fully recognizes and admits that it's not going anywhere, but I don't know why you would do something like that without at least having a conversation with the local legislators, but we'll see.
And that was an issue that we were going to bring up. Representative Knobloch, as you mentioned, from St. Cloud, I believe he was on that bonding trip and visited Glensheen. That was one of the reasons I think he brought that up. But there isn't a bill right now. Julie from Duluth was wondering, is there currently a bill to move ownership of Glensheen from the University of Minnesota to the State Historical Society? That's something that's...
I think he introduced a bill into the system, but it's well after deadline. Clearly it's not going to go anywhere this session, but it's a fair question to ask, and it's probably a good conversation to have, but it needs to be with all the stakeholders involved, and not, dropping a bill 3 weeks before the end of session is not helping anything.
And Representative Murphy?
Well, we should, it brings up the topic though, for when someone like the Congdon family deeded the Glensheen to the University of Minnesota Duluth. That was accepted by the university. And I imagine in order for it to have been accepted by the University of Minnesota Duluth, Regent Goldfein was on the board at the time. And it had to go through the Board of Regents. And so it was accepted by the university, and it was for the Duluth area. But something happened there that didn't happen when other things were deeded to the University of Minnesota, like the Bell Museum and the house for the president and a couple of other things that are in the metropolitan area. They get HEAPR money on a annual basis or biannual basis.
Can you explain what HEAPR money is?
HEAPR money is upkeep and assets and roofs and needed repairs. Those things that are other things that have been accepted by the University of Minnesota have been getting biannual grants or money like UMD gets, or Crookston gets, or the St. Paul campus gets, or Morris gets. But Glen Sheen was never put on that list for getting any money. And so there's never been any investment by the University of Minnesota for the infrastructure of Glen Sheen. And so it's been on what Glen Sheen could raise or what UMD could adequately or inadequately give to Glen Sheen for its upkeep over the years. And that has to be looked at. And we've brought that to the attention of the chancellor and the regents last fall at a meeting that we had with them, and said that, why don't we? And when are we going to get some?
So Representative Simonson, not getting that infrastructure just to help keep it in good shape, that hasn't been happening over the years.
It hasn't, and the longer we wait, the more it costs, right? So I think if something doesn't happen this year, it is an absolutely must do next year from the perspective that we're going to need to have a long-range plan. And that's partially what Representative Murphy is talking about, is getting it into a system where we can have a long-range plan on how we bring that facility back.
All right, Representative Metsa, we have a caller who called in a question about whether or not you support replacing the basketball floor in the Miners Memorial Building. Is that what the bonding money would do?
No. So there's the Miners Memorial Building project. Should the community want to put a basketball floor in? Yes, I'd be supportive of that. But right now, essentially, what the project is a 4-phase remodel of the entire complex. Just this winter, and I only live about a block and a half away from the building, we had a major 4-inch water pipe burst going in. And we're looking at a significant repair bill for that. It was about $80,000 just to get patched out literally the side of the building. They had to heat the big 4-inch copper pipe. And then now that was just a temporary repair. So when they bury it, which I think they've done now, it'll cost a lot more to go back in, get underground, and connect all that. So we're talking probably a couple $100,000 total the city will invest there. What our bill essentially would do is remodel the entire structure, get it up to the state it needs to be for both continued hockey games and then as well as convention space. This used to be a spot where people would have weddings, where the community would gather for a large variety of events. It still is, however, it needs those same type of repairs that have gotten just put off because we haven't funded, in my mind, adequately enough over many, many years in terms of LGA or county aid that was cut significantly during the Pawlenty administration. So those kind of investments got put off by the communities, and right now we're paying the price for it. But overall, yes, I would support a basketball court there if the community wanted it.
So there has never been one at Miners Memorial Building? Floor? I know they do that at Hibbings Memorial Building.
Yeah, so they've got floors and stuff. We've got a lot of great gyms in the area that have those resources. So I think as the plans go forward, if they had I know there was a talk of a sports arena type situation. There very well may be a basketball floor or a floating floor of some kind, at which point we could look at the numbers, and if they work, we'll make it work.
And while we have you here, we have a little less than 10 minutes left, I wanted to just have you give us an update on the Highway 53 bridge project just south of Virginia. Is that on schedule? That's a MnDOT project?
Yep, so everything's on schedule. There's one bill in, which we've talked about a number of times in the press over the last few months, and that's the $3.3 million in gap funding. And essentially what happened there was the city of Virginia was going to move its utilities between Midway and Virginia, and that's basically for those driving on 53 North, where the Dairy Queen is before you get to Virginia on the south side, and then as you're heading north still, going kind of all the way through Target. And so what we've got there is utilities that go through there to serve that community. We put in a bid thinking that we would be able to do the work locally. Turns out that when the state entered the bid with Kiewit Construction, they had to relinquish that control to Kiewit so that they could keep their deadline. Kiewit did not bid it the same way. They built in for more contingencies than we did, and it had a $3.3 million overage compared to where we were. In the grand scheme of the project, if all else stays on track and the budget stays on track, that's not too bad for overage. They are on schedule. Things are moving right along. A lot of local people home working, from our local building trades, which is great to see, and offsetting some of the work that's not getting done at the mines. I believe about 80 construction workers right now are out there. I just heard last night, I was out with some friends. Some of the engineers from the Kiewit company have been buying houses if they're moving their family for the next few years to the area. So that's all great news to hear, good for the community in many regards. But yeah, the project's on time as of right now and moving right along.
All right, thank you for that update. Representative Simonson, the Senate made a bit of a splash this week talking about consideration of new sentencing guidelines for those convicted of drug crimes. Is there anything happening on the House side, and do you feel like there is need for reform in those sentencing for criminals convicted of different drug crimes? I think these dealt with the so-called kingpin, the drug dealers.
Right. Well, there's definitely need for something. I mean, our prisons are overpopulated. Mm-hmm. We either need to build, add new beds, build new prisons, or we need to reform our sentencing guidelines. Mm-hmm. And that is the debate. Now we've not been able to really have this debate in the House because the majority party doesn't seem to be really interested in talking about it, but I think it's not an issue that's going to go away, and unless we as a state decide that we want to invest in more prisons and more beds, the only other answer is to reduce the sentencing guidelines or at least change them. So it's a conversation that needs to happen. I know that the Senate is far more aggressive, I guess you could say, in having that conversation, but so far on the House side, I've not seen a big interest from the majority party in even talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Representative Metsa, we have a situation where many drug users, people who are addicted, are ending up in jail. But the folks that are actually selling them the drugs, maybe the penalties aren't what they need to be to get those people off the streets?
Yeah, and so, over the past, basically my lifetime, 30 years, we've seen some significant changes in mandatory minimums that our federal government made, and it was well intended, I believe, when they came up with this stuff, but a lot of it put someone, say, who goes to UMD here who might have used marijuana recreationally during college, who gets in trouble. That could follow their record. Depending on the amount, they could end up in jail. And overall, I think what we missed the mark on with the mandatory minimums was actually getting the people the help that they need. You're dealing with folks who are probably, the ones that are probably getting addicted are the more likely who would, be prone to drinking more, smoking cigarettes, any number of things. And so I think we have a serious mental health crisis all over the country, and that we should be investing dollars in that and making sure that we're getting people treatment versus jail time, and that would go a long ways to making some of this work. And the bill essentially in the Senate does part of that by giving the drug dealers a much stiffer sentence and actually providing some less sentencing for the folks. What I would like to see get in there for sure, though, is that mental health aspect, because I believe as whether it be in our public schools, in our workplaces, that people should have a place to go when they're having a hard time, and if they get the help when they need it, that there'd be significantly less problems that we deal with as a society by getting them that help they need when they need it.
And Representative Murphy, Representative Simonson mentioned, building new prisons, and there are actually private prisons out there. I believe there's one in western Minnesota that's been a subject of some debate. I think it was closed. The state was talking about maybe reopening it. We only have about 2 minutes left, so I'm just kind of throwing out a question to you about crime and punishment, I guess, and drugs.
Can I make a really bad joke and say this is our Hail Mary?
Your Hail Mary.
I think the next 2 weeks will decide whether there is a need and whether we accept the Senate plan or not. And I think that they will. I think the sentencing guideline, that they have not taken it lightly, made their projections based on research and based on real statistics and real people that are now in prison, and whether they would be continue to be addicted or whatever, or buying or whatever. And I think they're pretty generous in saying they're safe to be let out. And I think we will have a resolution within the next 2 weeks on that issue.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. Representative Mary Murphy, a Democrat from Hermantown, Representative Jason Metza, Democrat from Virginia, and Representative Eric Simonson, Democrat from Duluth. Thank you very much. I didn't do a very good job with the intro introducing each of you, so I wanted to get that in for sure. We're out of time this week on Minnesota Legislative Report. Thanks again to all the lawmakers who make this program possible, and thanks to everyone who calls with their questions or emails their questions. Please join us again next Sunday for our final program of the session. For the crew here at WDSC TV, I'm Greg Grell. Have a great evening.